James Carter had spent years serving his country, putting his life on the line in dangerous missions. Now he was just another man driving home on a quiet evening, thinking about his family and what he would have for dinner. The sun had set, and the streets were calm, but that peace didn't last long. As he turned onto the main road, he saw flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was right behind him, siren blaring. Confused, he pulled over to the side of the road, keeping his hands on the steering wheel. He had done nothing wrong, so why were they stopping him? The door of the police car swung open, and two officers stepped out, walking towards him with serious expressions. One of them placed a hand on his holster, ready for anything. "Step out of the vehicle," one officer shouted. His voice was sharp, leaving no room for argument. James hesitated for a moment. He had been through worse situations in life, but this felt different. There was something in their eyes, something that told him this wasn't a routine stop. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt and pushed the car door open. As soon as he was out, one of the officers grabbed his wrist and turned him around. Before he could ask what was happening, cold steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. "You're under arrest," the officer said, tightening the handcuffs. James felt a wave of shock rush through his body. What? What did I do?" The officers didn't answer. One of them patted him down while the other radioed something back to the station. People passing by slowed down to watch. A woman across the street pulled out her phone, recording the entire thing. "This is a mistake," James insisted, trying to stay calm. "I'm a veteran. I served my country." One officer scoffed. "Yeah, we'll see about that." They shoved him toward the police car, forcing him into the back seat. The doors slammed shut behind him, locking him in. His heart pounded in his chest. This couldn't be happening. He had spent years following the law, fighting for justice, and now he was sitting in the back of a police car like a criminal. As the car started moving, James stared at his reflection in the window. His hands were shaking, but not from fear, from anger. He needed answers. He needed to know why he was being treated like this. The streets outside blurred past him, the city lights glowing in the darkness. He thought about his family, his friends, and what they would think when they found out. At the station, the officers pulled him out of the car and led him inside. The air was thick with the smell of coffee and old paper. Other officers glanced at him as he was walked past their desks. Some of them whispered to each other. It was as if they all knew something he didn't. They brought him to a small interrogation room and pushed him onto a metal chair. The room was cold and empty, except for a table and another chair on the other side. The only light came from the dim bowl hanging above. Minutes passed, maybe hours. James lost track of time. No one came in. No one told him anything. He sat there, staring at the blank wall, replaying the arrest in his mind. It made no sense. There had to be a reason for all this. Finally, the door creaked open. A man in a suit walked in, holding a file in his hands. He placed it on the table, sat down, and looked straight at James. "James Carter," he said, flipping through the papers. "You're in a lot of trouble." James leaned forward. "For what?" The man smirked. "Impersonation. Fraud. You've been pretending to be a veteran." James felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "That's a lie," he said, his voice firm. "I served. I have records. I have medals." The man shook his head. "No, you don't. According to official records, you never served a single day in the military." James's hands clenched into fists. This was insane. How could they say that? He had spent years in uniform, risking his life. But now, the people who were supposed to protect justice were telling him that his entire life was a lie. He stared at the man in front of him, his mind racing. Something wasn't right. There was more to this than just a simple mistake. And deep down, James knew this was only the beginning. "You said." James sat frozen in the cold metal chair, his mind struggling to make sense of what he had just heard. The officer across from him continued flipping through the file, acting as if this was just another routine case. But to James, it was something far bigger. It was his entire life being erased in front of his eyes. "I don't understand," James said, his voice calm but firm. "I served in the military. I was deployed multiple times. I'd bled for this country." The officer leaned back in his chair, studying him like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "That's not what our records show," he said. "According to the system, James Carter never enlisted. There's no military history, no service number, nothing." James's jaw tightened. "That's impossible. Check again." The officer slid the file across the table. "These are the official records from the military database. You see any mention of your name in there?" James hesitated before looking down. The papers inside were filled with names, numbers, service histories, proof of real soldiers who had served, but his name was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had never existed. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. He knew who he was. He remembered the long nights in the desert, the weight of his rifle in his hands, the missions that had taken everything from him. He remembered the faces of the men he had fought beside. How could all of that just disappear? "This is a mistake," he said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Someone deleted my records. Maybe it was a clerical error." The officer shook his head. "This isn't a small mistake, Mr. Carter. We've dealt with cases like this before. People pretending to be veterans for benefits, for respect, for money." James slammed his fists on the table, causing the officer to flinch. "I am not pretending." His voice echoed in the small room. "I don't need to fake my service. I earned my medals. I fought for this country." The officer sighed and leaned forward. "Then prove it." James stared at him, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. "Fine," he said. "Call the Pentagon. Call my old unit. I have people who can verify my service." The officer raised an eyebrow. "The Pentagon?" There was a hint of amusement in his voice. "That's a bold request." James met his gaze without blinking. "Do it. And when they confirm who I am, I expect an apology." The officer tapped his fingers on the table, considering the request. Then, without a word, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving James alone once again. The silence in the room felt heavier than before. James leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. If the system showed no record of his service, then something deeper was going on. And if the Pentagon was involved, then the truth was bigger than he had imagined. Minutes passed, then an hour. The door finally opened again, but this time it wasn't the same officer. A new man walked in, older, dressed in a sharp suit, his expression unreadable. He closed the door behind him and placed a sealed file on the table. James straightened up. Something about this man felt different. The man sat down, keeping his eyes on James. Then, after a long pause, he pushed the file forward. "You're right," he said. "You did serve." James exhaled in relief, but before he could speak, the man continued. "But here's the problem. Your service was classified. And now we have a bigger issue." James frowned. "What issue?" The man leaned in slightly. "The fact that we're having this conversation means someone made a very big mistake." He tapped the sealed file. "And if your name was erased from the system, there was a reason for that. The question is, who wanted you to disappear?" A chill ran down James's spine. This wasn't just a case of missing records. This was something far more dangerous. James felt his breath slow as he stared at the sealed file on the table. The man in the suit sat perfectly still, watching him with an unreadable expression. The air in the room seemed heavier now, thick with unspoken truths. "I don't understand," James finally said. "If my records were classified, why am I sitting in this interrogation room? Why was I arrested like a criminal?" The man exhaled slowly, tapping a finger against the file. "Because someone wanted you to be," he said. "Someone high enough to make sure your records disappeared. Someone powerful enough to erase your existence from the system." James clenched his fists. And now, the man opened the file and slid a single page toward James. The words at the top sent a chill through his spine. Classified operation. Authorized to personnel only. Underneath, there was a grainy black and white photograph of a much younger James, dressed in combat gear, standing beside a group of soldiers. The faces of the others were blurred out. The name of the mission was blacked out. James's eyes darted back to the man. Where did this come from? The man smirked. The Pentagon. James leaned forward. Then they know the truth. They can clear this up. The smirk faded. That's the problem, the man said. They didn't send this file to help you. James felt his stomach tighten. What do you mean? The man leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. The moment we accessed your classified records, we triggered a flag. Someone inside the Pentagon was alerted. He tapped the file again. And trust me, that's not a good thing. James swallowed hard. He had faced enemies on the battlefield, but this was different. This wasn't war. This was something darker. So what now? He asked. The man sighed and sat back. Now we wait, because whoever erased you from the system, they know you're back. James felt his pulse quicken. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls were closing in. Somewhere, someone had gone to great lengths to erase his past, and now they knew he was looking for answers, which meant they were coming for him. You said. James sat in silence, his eyes locked onto the classified document in front of him. His mind raced, trying to piece together the truth. Someone had erased his past. Someone had wanted him to disappear. And now, they knew he was back. The man across the table watched him carefully, his fingers tapping lightly against the folder. You still don't get it, do you? He said. This isn't just about an arrest. This isn't just about your records being wiped. This is about what happens next. James narrowed his eyes. What are you saying? The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. You were never supposed to be found. A chill ran down James's spine. The weight of those words settled in his chest like a stone. He had spent years risking his life for his country, believing in duty and honor. But now, the very system he had fought for was treating him like a ghost. Before James could respond, the door to the interrogation room burst open. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their faces tense. One of them held a phone in his hand, gripping it tightly like it carried a message no one wanted to deliver. We have a situation, the officer said, his voice clipped. The man in the suit turned his head slowly. What kind of situation? The officer hesitated. Then, in a controlled but urgent tone, he said, The Pentagon just called. James's muscles tensed. The officer continued, They're sending someone. High level. They want to speak to him immediately. For the first time, James saw something in the man's eyes. Concern. It was slight, but it was there. He turned back to James and exhaled. Well, he said, I guess your past just caught up with you. James sat still as the officers exchanged looks. The air in the room felt heavier now, thick with tension. Then the officer holding the phone spoke again. They said one more thing, he added. We're to hold him here. No one in, no one out. Until they arrive. James felt his pulse quicken. Whoever had erased his past was coming. And this time, he had no idea what they wanted. The room fell into an eerie silence. James could feel the tension growing, tightening around him like an invisible rope. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their posture stiff. Something wasn't right. Did they say who was coming? The man in the suit asked, his voice unusually cautious. The officer holding the phone shook his head. No names, just instructions to hold him here and wait. James didn't like this. He had been on too many high-risk missions to ignore the warning signs. Whenever people moved in silence, without names, without details, it meant trouble. The man in the suit seemed to sense it too. He pushed back his chair and stood up, adjusting his tie. "I need to make a call," he muttered, then turned to James. "Stay put." James smirked. "Not like I have a choice." The man left the room, shutting the door behind him. James watched the officers carefully. Their hands were close to their holsters. They were nervous. But why? Minutes passed. The clock on the wall ticked, slow and steady. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. James straightened in his seat. He had seen this before. Not in police stations, but in the field. Power fluctuations like that. It wasn't random. It meant someone was messing with the system. The officers seemed to notice too. One of them reached for his radio. "Dispatch, we just had." The lights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the room. James heard the sharp click of safeties being switched off. The officers drew their weapons, their silhouettes barely visible. The tension was now suffocating. Then, somewhere in the distance, a door slammed open. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Coming closer. James stayed still, his heartbeat steady, his instincts sharp. He might not have known what was happening, but one thing was certain. Whoever was coming wasn't here for a friendly chat. A loud buzz echoed through the station as the emergency backup lights flickered on. Dim red lights now bathed the room in a haunting glow. The officers positioned themselves near the door, guns raised. Then the handle turned. James held his breath. The door swung open slowly, and a shadowed figure stepped inside. Dressed in all black, wearing no visible badge, no uniform, just a presence that demanded attention. One of the officers aimed. "Identify yourself." The figure took another step forward, unfazed. Then, in a calm, controlled voice, they spoke. "Stand down. He's coming with me." James's blood ran cold. Whoever they weren't here to ask questions. They were here to take him. "You said." The silence that followed was heavier than anything James had ever felt. The officers didn't lower their weapons, their fingers hovering near the triggers. The man in black stood still, his face unreadable in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. James could tell this wasn't a cop. He wasn't a government agent either, not the usual kind, at least. His stance, his confidence, the way he carried himself, it reminded James of something. Military, but not just any soldier. Special ops. The officer closest to James tightened his grip on his gun. "I said, identify yourself." The man in black tilted his head slightly, as if debating whether to respond. Then, finally, he spoke. "You don't have clearance to ask me that." James's stomach twisted. That wasn't an answer. It was a warning. And the officers knew it. One of them shifted uncomfortably, his confidence cracking. The man in black took another step forward. "Stand down." The officer hesitated, then glanced at James. "What's going on here?" he demanded. "Why is the Pentagon so interested in you?" James had no answer. He had been asking himself the same thing since the moment they told him his records were erased. The man in black sighed, as if bored of the conversation. "We don't have time for this." He reached into his pocket, not for a weapon, but for something small and metallic. He tossed it onto the table. It was a coin. Not just any coin. A challenge coin. Military issued. But this one was different. The insignia was unfamiliar, something James had never seen before. The officers looked at it, confused. But James understood. In the military, these coins were symbols of belonging, proof that you were part of something bigger. But this coin wasn't normal. It was a message, a silent order. James met the man's gaze. "What do you want?" The man in black didn't blink. "To fix a mistake." James's pulse quickened. A mistake. Before he could ask, the radio on the officer's vest crackled to life. A frantic voice came through. "Multiple unidentified vehicles approaching the station. No plates. No insignia. We don't know who they are." A loud crash interrupted the transmission. The officers flinched. James stayed perfectly still. He had been in too many firefights not to recognize what was coming. This wasn't a rescue. This was a cleanup. And James was the target. The first gunshot shattered the silence. James ducked instinctively as one of the officers cried out, collapsing against the wall. The second officer spun around, his weapon raised, but he was too slow. The man in black moved like a shadow, quick, precise, deadly. Before the officer could fire, he was disarmed with a swift strike to the wrist, his gun clattering to the floor. A second blow sent him sprawling. James didn't wait for an explanation. He lunged for cover as more gunfire erupted outside the station. Whoever was coming wasn't here to negotiate. The man in black crouched beside him, calm despite the chaos. "We need to go. Now." James glanced toward the fallen officers. "You just killed them." "They were already dead," the man replied coldly. "You will be too if you stay here." James clenched his jaw. He had spent years following orders, trusting the system. But right now, the system had turned against him. Someone wanted him erased. Another explosion rocked the building. The emergency lights flickered again, casting shadows against the cracked walls. The man in black grabbed James's wrist. "Move." James yanked his arm back. "Not until I get answers." The man exhaled sharply, as if he didn't have time for this. "They're here to clean up their mess. You are the mess." James's mind raced. Someone had erased his past. Someone had sent men to kill him. And now, this stranger was his only way out. Another round of gunfire tore through the station. A bullet whizzed past, splintering the wood beside James's head. The man in black didn't wait this time. He grabbed James by the shirt and yanked him forward. "You can ask questions later." James made a split-second decision. Live now, figure it out later. He sprinted behind the man, weaving through the crumbling station as more masked figures stormed in. The sound of boots, of orders shouted in clipped voices, filled the air. These weren't police. They weren't military. They were something else. James had no time to think. He followed the man through a back exit, out into the freezing night. A black SUV idled in the alley, engine running. The man flung open the door. "Get in." James hesitated, but the sound of gunfire inside made his decision for him. He dove into the seat. The man jumped in after him, slamming the door. "Drive." The vehicle lurched forward just as more masked figures burst from the station, weapons raised. Bullets shattered the back window as they sped away. James sat back, his breath heavy. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned to the man beside him. "Start talking." The man in black finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then, in a quiet voice, he said something that sent a chill down James's spine. "They didn't erase your records to hide you." James frowned. "Then why?" The man met his eyes. "They erased you because you saw something you weren't supposed to." The first gunshot shattered the silence. James ducked instinctively as one of the officers cried out, collapsing against the wall. The second officer spun around, his weapon raised, but he was too slow. The man in black moved like a shadow, quick, precise, deadly. Before the officer could fire, he was disarmed with a swift strike to the wrist, his gun clattering to the floor. A second blow sent him sprawling. James didn't wait for an explanation. He lunged for cover as more gunfire erupted outside the station. Whoever was coming wasn't here to negotiate. The man in black crouched beside him, calm despite the chaos. "We need to go. Now." James glanced toward the fallen officers. "You just killed them." "They were already dead," the man replied coldly. "You will be too if you stay here." James clenched his jaw. He had spent years following orders, trusting the system. But right now, the system had turned against him. Someone wanted him erased. Another explosion rocked the building. The emergency lights flickered again, casting shadows against the cracked walls. The man in black grabbed James's wrist. "Move." James yanked his arm back. "Not until I get answers." The man exhaled sharply, as if he didn't have time for this. They're here to clean up their mess. You are the mess. James's mind raced. Someone had erased his past. Someone had sent men to kill him. And now, this stranger was his only way out. Another round of gunfire tore through the station. A bullet whizzed past, splintering the wood beside James's head. The man in black didn't wait this time. He grabbed James by the shirt and yanked him forward. You can ask questions later. James made a split-second decision. Live now, figure it out later. He sprinted behind the man, weaving through the crumbling station as more masked figures stormed in. The sound of boots, of orders shouted in clipped voices, filled the air. These weren't police. They weren't military. They were something else. James had no time to think. He followed the man through a back exit, out into the freezing night. A black SUV idled in the alley, engine running. The man flung open the door. Get in. James hesitated, but the sound of gunfire inside made his decision for him. He dove into the seat. The man jumped in after him, slamming the door. Drive. The vehicle lurched forward just as more masked figures burst from the station, weapons raised. Bullets shattered the back window as they sped away. James sat back, his breath heavy. His heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. He turned to the man beside him. Start talking. The man in black finally looked at him, his expression unreadable. Then, in a quiet voice, he said something that sent a chill down James's spine. They didn't erase your records to hide you. James frowned. Then why? The man met his eyes. They erased you because you saw something you weren't supposed to.